old bullion. And although he was committed to prison for several years, it was clear that once his sentence was served, he would continue the life of a wealthy man. "I can't understand," I said to Holmes a couple of evenings later, "why you seem so damnably happy." "A man is never more content, Watson," he said, "than when doing well what his nature has fitted him to do. On which thought, will you pass me the tobacco pouch? I think we should indulge ourselves in a brace of good pipes." The Trinity Vicarage Larceny. One fine spring morning, Sherlock Holmes and I received into our rooms a portly gentleman in a purple dress. That at least is how it momentarily appeared to me, as I glanced up from the Daily Chronicle at the open door. The purple gentleman, it transpired, was the Right Reverend the Lord Bishop of Kent, an old acquaintance of Holmes, and he had brought with him, as so many of our visitors do, a problem that was clearly causing him some agitation. Mollified a little by coffee and a cigar, Bishop Spriggs needed no prompting to divulge his story. "The nub of my problem, gentlemen, is an unfortunate young priest. A young man of promise and talent, very popular with his parishioners, who has inadvertently got himself into deep water." "Intriguing," said Holmes. "You may recall," the clergyman continued, "that Trinity Church in the Kent village of Hetchingham was last year in the news because of an exceptional discovery." "Of course," I said. "A silver chalice of considerable worth was discovered in the crypt." "Yes, Dr. Watson, a magnificent medieval relic, the so-called Hetchingham Grail, weighing some 22 pounds. With my approval it was sold to the British Museum, with the idea that a good portion of the proceeds would go towards restoring Hetchingham Church. The Reverend Kingsley, pending the beginning of the building work, had locked the money up in the church crypt. It was stolen yesterday. Holmes, you can imagine what an outcry there'd be if this found its way into the papers. It would be bad for Kingsley and the Hetchingham parish, and goodness alone knows what it would do for the reputation of the church. At any cost, the money must be recovered and the thief put away. And I mean any cost, Holmes. Let us not concern ourselves with fees just yet," Holmes said. "Are there any clues at all as to who might be responsible for this theft?" "I'm not sure about clues," replied the clergyman. "Kingsley did make some sort of an attempt to discover the identity of the villain by chasing him over the fields after the theft, but I'm afraid he didn't get very far." "I think we had better meet the young reverend," said Holmes. as soon as is practical. Watson, would you be at liberty to accompany me to Hatchingham for a few days?" "I'm utterly indebted to you both," said the bishop. "I dare say while you're in Hatchingham we could put you up at the Trinity Church Rectory. Or there's the Jolly Bulldog, if you'd prefer an inn." "Ah," said Holmes, "the Jolly Bulldog. Now that sounds like just my kind of animal." We journeyed to Hatchingham the next morning, and established ourselves at the cosy but crumbling hostelry that was the Jolly Bulldog. Our landlord was a bluff man called Starkey, taller by inches than Holmes, and compelled to stoop to avoid the beams of his own ceiling as he lumbered about in heavy boots serving his customers. He grudgingly provided us with a late snack of bread and some rather tough cold meats, complaining that if everyone chose to be fed at 2:30 in the afternoon, they would have to invent a new word for the meal taken between luncheon and dinner. "Leftovers?" said Holmes to me impishly, and at a level which I am sure Starkey was meant to overhear. "Might be that word?" The publican growled ominously as he left us, and I leaned over to Holmes and whispered, "There is surely an example of how a little power may go to the head of a man and make him too big for his boots." "I was thinking rather," said Holmes, "from the way he clumps about this place, that his boots are rather too big for him." I saw the two gentlemen on a nearby table smile at this remark. "I shouldn't take a lot of notice of Starkey," said one of them amiably. "He's just as tiresome with all the customers." The gentleman introduced himself as John Hapton, and his companion as Matthew Winslow. Although neither Holmes nor myself disclosed the details of our mission to Hatchingham, it seems they knew we were expected, and it turned out that both gentlemen were members of the parish committee, and were fully apprised of the theft, though they were quick to assert that it was not yet public knowledge. "I hope you will be successful," said Hapton, "in bringing this thief to book. We are fond of our vicar, and he has been a deeply troubled young man since it happened." The Reverend Kingsley's house was accessed from Hatchingham Lane by a short stone path. A few steps beyond the vicarage stood the church, with, on the west side, a moderate-sized graveyard. On the other side, with its own access to the lane and shaded by a handful of fruit trees, stood Cherry Cottage, which we would later discover to be the residence of the verger and his wife. The Reverend Kingsley was a man in his early 30s, small in stature but of good looks, his clerical dress the quintessence of neatness. While clearly stricken by his predicament, he remained calm and articulate, and did his best to make us welcome in a pleasantly appointed parlour whose deep-coloured, thick-piled carpet and embroidered cushions evidenced a delicate sense of taste. "It's a relief to see you, gentlemen," he said. "The bishop told me all about you, about your many successes in solving complex cases. The problem, as you know, is that while we saw the thief escape, we were unable to establish his identity. However, there are one or two factors which, though they seem opaque to my own consideration, might prove illuminating under your own, if I might show you. I would be most grateful, Mr. Kingsley, Holmes said. First, though, I see that you have recently held a meeting in this charming room. I presume that apart from the 3 other gentlemen present, the 4th was yourself? You keep the side chairs in another room, I take it. Good Lord, how did you know all that? Oh, it's a simple matter. The carpet beside the window has indentations of 4 chairs, and therefore I presume for 4 people, but there are no chairs in the room whose feet would match. Well, yes, you are, of course, quite correct, said Kingsley with a broad smile. The parish committee convened here just yesterday, as we do each week. Yesterday was the day I broke the news that the Grail money had been stolen, and I hope that that news will remain privy to the committee members until such time as the thief is caught, but— The vicar paused, and Holmes said, Please, go on, Mr. Kingsley. But, continued the young clergyman, the gentlemen on the parish committee are the same 3 who sat here 2 weeks ago, when I revealed that the money for the Grail was in the crypt of the church. Only they and I knew of the fact, you see, so I can no longer be as confident as before that they are all honest men, which is a most unfortunate thing. It was all in cash, I presume, Holmes said. Yes, Mr. Holmes. I kept cash so that I could employ local men to restore the church and pay them by the day. I have little time to run to the bank and make a withdrawal every time a man finishes plastering a wall. The money was under lock and key. Yes. There is a safe in the crypt where the church's small treasures have always been secreted. And the crypt itself is locked? Yes. It can be entered either from within the church or by a door leading from the churchyard, and both those doors are locked at night. Mr. Holmes, I do hope you can help me with this. I don't know how my flock will ever forgive me if that money is not returned. Then perhaps, if you can bear to go over it all again, you would be so kind as to tell Dr. Watson and myself the circumstances of the robbery. Yes, of course. 2 weeks ago, looking out of this window on a Monday morning at about 11, I saw a man— I'm fairly certain it was a man— standing at the lich gate and looking over into the churchyard. I would not have given this a moment's thought, except that he wore a hat with an unusually wide brim, and had it pulled so low over his eyes, and his collar so high that one could not distinguish his features. As I say, I cannot even be certain it was not a woman, except for his way of moving. I watched him for a good 10 minutes before he turned and strode back along the lane towards the village. That same afternoon, this time from an upstairs window, I saw him again, but now further along the lane, standing under a tree and once again seeming to study the church and its grounds. His contrived anonymity naturally put me on my guard. In the evening after those first 2 sightings, I was sitting in that very chair, Dr. Watson, which you are currently occupying, when a thought hit me like a bolt of lightning, a thought which you no doubt will be surprised had not occurred to me earlier. that this stranger might have designs on the money in the crypt. After this alarming epiphany, I spoke to my verger Sam Manners and his wife May, who keep house for me. They live in Cherry Cottage, which, as you will have seen, stands on the lane beside the church's lich gate. There's a short cut from their back door to this house, which they employ when they wish to see me. I mention that because, as I think you will agree, it bears upon the matter. I asked them to report to me if this sinister figure, or anyone else unknown to them, appeared in the vicinity of the church. And indeed, it seems as if the man in that hat had begun to watch my whereabouts, because first May Manners, then her husband, reported to me that they had indeed seen the man in the hat. I began to feel that an attempt on the money was imminent. I resolved then to remain in the vicarage or the church grounds until I was certain that the threat had passed. I instructed Mr. and Mrs. Manners that if they saw the stranger again, they were to take the short cut to my house and inform me immediately, but they were under no circumstances to approach him. And now we come to the day of the theft. Sam Manners was whitewashing the walls of the church. At this point Holmes stood up. "I think it would be as well, Mr. Kingsley, to acquaint ourselves with the geography of the church and its grounds. Might we continue outside?" A rapturous afternoon of sunshine and birdsong greeted us as we left the vicarage and walked out into the churchyard, where the Reverend Kingsley commenced our guided tour. I immediately began to locate us on a mental map of Hatchingham village and its surrounding areas, a practice I learned in my military days and which has served me well in civilian life. I could see in my mind the large oblong of farmland, about 2 miles across, with Hatchingham village and the church almost at opposite corners. This substantial area of land was surrounded on all 4 sides by public roads. Mr. Kingsley took us through the grounds on a grassy path which ran along the side of the church up against the gravestones of the churchyard. "This is the wall of the church Sam Manners was painting that morning," said the vicar. "He worked for a couple of hours, and at 12 o'clock I sent him off to his cottage for his regular midday meal. I went back into the vicarage and took up a book. After about 20 minutes there was a knock at the back door. Mrs. Manners was in a frantic state. She and Sam had just seen the man in the white-brimmed hat going into the churchyard. I told her to return immediately, and to tell Sam to meet me here at the crypt door, and I came here directly to find myself staring at a spectacular mess." He pointed to a flight of 4 steps just off the path, leading to a door low down in the half-painted church wall. "The door to the crypt," he said, "from which the thief must have made his exit, and not expecting to encounter a paint bucket, presumably kicked it flying in his haste to escape." A residual expanse of powdery white, still damp in places, stained the flagstones at the bottom of the steps. "Sam was with me within seconds," continued the vicar. "We could see nobody, but we soon guessed which way he'd gone. If you'll follow me, gentlemen." The vicar led us a little further along the grassy path, to where the churchyard ended in a wooden fence. Set into the fence was a stile leading on to a footpath. That, said the vicar, was his escape route. Beyond the stile, the ragged footpath traversed the meadow through weeds and rough grasses, stretching away into the distance. Along this narrow track could be seen intermittent blobs of white. "And I suppose the presumption would be," said Holmes, "that the trail of white paint marks are the fleeing man's footsteps." "Yes, exactly. Obviously our man escaped across the field to Harding Lane, Mr. Holmes." My companion nodded. He stopped at the stile. "There are 2 white handprints here," he said. "A right hand and a left hand. The fellow was in some haste, as indeed one would expect." Holmes crossed the stile athletically and walked a little way into the field. Bending down, he examined one of the white marks, then plucked up a handful of grass and returned to us. "Thank you, Mr. Kingsley. I think I've seen all I need to here. Is there anything else you think might help us?" "Yes," said the vicar enthusiastically. "Back at the house." Holmes requested that Sam Manners and his wife join us in the vicarage, and a little afterwards in Mr. Kingsley's kitchen. Mrs. Manners set herself to the task of making us all tea, while Holmes paced the stone floor slowly. I sat at the kitchen table with the vicar and Sam Manners, a ruddy man in his early 40s, whom Holmes was now addressing. "So, Mr. Manners, you are the only person to have caught a glimpse of the man in the hat on the day of the robbery?" "I believe so, sir. I was at the window taking my lunch. I saw this feller in the big hat looking up and down the lane a few times as if to check all was clear, then enter the churchyard. Straight away I said to Mrs. Manners to go by the back door and tell the vicar." "And you yourself waited in the cottage until Mrs. Manners returned?" "I did, sir." "For how long?" "Not more than 2 minutes. She told me the vicar wanted me to meet him out by the church. I dashed right out." "And found the Reverend Kingsley waiting for you?" "Yes, sir, and the door to the crypt wide open and whitewash everywhere." The crypt door had been locked before you went to lunch?" "Oh, yes, Mr. Holmes, it always was." "And that was when you noticed the trail of paint?" "Exactly, sir, and set off to follow it. You must have only been a short way behind the thief." "Must have been, sir, but he moved like the wind. We was across that meadow in less than 5 minutes. It's a good 4 furlongs, and never caught up to him. But what we found at the opposite side clinched it." Here Mr. Kingsley interrupted. "Sam means this," he said, and produced from a drawer a wide-brimmed black velvet hat, inexpensively made, and in shape rather resembling the sort of thing one sees worn by picadors in pictures of bullfights. Holmes took the hat and turned it around in his hands. "It was me found it, sir," said Manners. "I was running a bit ahead of the Reverend, hoping to catch up with our thief, and as soon as I was over the stile I saw it in the grass by the road, just where I suppose it had fallen from his head." "Well," said Holmes, "while I cannot see yet how that will help us, with your permission I shall take it away with me." "Of course," said the vicar. "We'll leave you then. but by way of that path across the fields. I'd rather like to follow the route taken by our escaping felon." And so it was that we made our farewells and set out from the churchyard across the wide meadow towards Harding Lane. Although it had been a week since the church thief had fled, there remained a clear trail of white footprints across the entire width of the field. The path ended at another stile, which gave onto the shaded narrowness of Harding Lane. We calculated that to return to Hatchingham village we could go in either direction around the perimeter of the meadow. We took the route west along the Pincham Road rather than going east and back via the church. As we walked, my companion looked repeatedly this way and that, into the fields at the roadside, the patches of scrubland, and the bushes and trees. "If you note anything, you must let me know, Watson." And I agreed that I would. But the fields lay bright and innocent in the late afternoon air, and the trees were populated only by birds jubilantly enjoying the sunshine. Then, as we crossed a bridge over a gurgling stream, Holmes stopped halfway. "There's something there. Do you see?" He pointed to the bank of the stream, above which a hawthorn overhung the rushing water. "Something that bush." "A pair of somethings, unless I'm mistaken." We clambered over the balustrade of the little bridge and dropped onto the bankside. The hawthorn was thick, and even at close quarters my eyes were at pains to penetrate into its depths. Holmes, using a fallen branch the thickness of his arm, smashed his way into the bush. His soft cry of triumph told me he had found something, and he reached in and retrieved in one hand a large pair of leather boots. "What do you think, Watson? Is this or is this not the footwear of our thief?" "They're certainly large, those of a very big man, I should say, and there are white marks on the soles. Should we see how they fit those prints on the church meadow?" "I think we can assume that much, Watson. But what would induce the villain to jettison his boots here?" "Perhaps," I said, "he thought he was still being chased, and knew that if he were caught wearing them he would be recognized straight away." "Equally suspicious if he'd been found with no boots at all," said Holmes, "though I suppose he may have carried a spare pair of shoes with him. Watson, it is fairly clear to me the thief is a local man. Why, unless he feared to be recognized, would he indulge in such an elaborate disguise? Let us go back to the Jolly Bulldog. That, after all, is where the locals like to congregate." In fact, on our return to the inn, we found John Hapton and Matthew Winslow, the parish committee men we had met earlier, having returned to, or perhaps never having left, the same table. As we sat down, Holmes placed beside him on the floorboards the pair of boots we had found in the hedgerow, causing the two gentlemen to look at them inquisitively. When Starkey, the landlord, arrived to serve us, the first thing he said was, "Your boots, gentlemen?" "Not ours," said Holmes. "We found them in a bush in Harding Lane." "Strange what some folks'll throw away," said the publican. They looks in prime order to me. Hardly been worn, Holmes replied, and then he asked, Would these boots fit you, Mr. Starkey? And seeing our companions on the nearby table watching, he added, Or either of you, gentlemen? Not me, sir, Starkey replied, rather more amiably than I had expected. I know my boots look weighty, but my feet ain't so big as you might think. It's just I'm subject to blisters. But you find big boots help your blisters? I asked, my experience of patients suffering with that condition telling me the opposite. No, sir. To start the blisters, I need to put on 3 pairs of thick hose, so I always gets my boots well over my proper foot size. Then, rather sardonically, he said, Thank you, though, for asking, sir. Mr. Hampton on the next table asked, Do you mind me asking, sir, what's your interest in boots? Holmes said, It's an investigation we are conducting in which boots have, well, some scientific significance. Then to me he whispered as our neighbour turned away with a disbelieving grimace, It's as I thought, Watson. We have our culprit. Starkey? No, not Starkey. One of these? And I indicated with my thumb the 2 men from the parish committee. No, Watson. Who, then? These boots, Watson, do you observe nothing untoward about them? No, not at all. They're practically new. They're of a large size. Apart from that, they are undistinguished. On the contrary, my friend, I would say they were distinguished by a lack of paint. I beg your pardon? I mean, Watson, that there are white marks on the soles, to be sure. But tell me, pray, how a man with his hands covered in whitewash could have unlaced and removed his boots without leaving marks on the laces? I don't know, I said. But it would be a singular coincidence if someone completely innocent had jettisoned a pair of boots with paint on the soles. There is no coincidence, Holmes said. These boots were undoubtedly left here by the thief, but not in the way we were intended to believe. Are you suggesting that you know who the thief is? The thief, Watson, is the Reverend Kingsley himself. But how could it be, Holmes? There was no time for him to escape across that meadow and return to the vicarage in time to meet Sam Manners outside the church. How can a man chase himself across a meadow? As you know, Watson, we are due to meet the bishop this evening at Trinity Vicarage. So let us finish our meal. I will explain everything there. We had promised the bishop an interim meeting at the vicarage to advise him of our progress in the case, which no doubt the clergyman expected to be only moderate this soon after our previous meeting. But we had hardly settled to our sherry in Mr. Kingsley's comfortable parlour than Holmes declared dramatically, "You will no doubt be delighted to know, gentlemen, that Dr. Watson and I have solved the case." I did not think it my business to confess that after my previous conversation with Holmes I was as much in the dark as anyone, but I sat quietly sipping my sherry while I watched my friend open the bag we had brought from the inn and remove the 2 large white-stained boots we had found beside the stream. The bishop's eyes widened. I have to say he looked incredulous. Mr. Kingsley, too, wore a sceptical smirk and raised his eyebrows.
"Please tell us, Mr. Holmes, what you think you have found?"
"Dr. Watson and I found these," Holmes explained, "in a bramble bush in Harding Lane. Big boots suggested we were seeking a big man, yet the footprints told us his stride was short. It was our landlord at the Jolly Bulldog who enabled me to understand the dichotomy. He is a man who buys bigger boots than his foot size in order to accommodate extra socks. Our villain, however, bought his bigger boots in order to accommodate another pair of shoes, leaving the footprints of a bigger man than he is himself. Is that not so, Mr. Kingsley?" The young vicar, I thought at the time, if he was guilty of anything, was heroically cool about it. He betrayed nothing but genteel surprise. "Are you suggesting that I was the thief, Mr. Holmes?" "Holmes," said the bishop gravely, "from what I understand, Mr. Kingsley and his verger practically managed to catch up with the thief on that fateful day. What on earth do you think is the evidence for this assertion?" "My lord," Holmes said confidently, "Mr. Kingsley wished to embezzle the money raised by the sale of the Hatchingham Grail and decided to construct a piece of theatre which would deceive investigators. He not only invented the spectral man in the large-brimmed hat, he also on several occasions paraded in the hat and the high-collared coat, and ensured that Mr. and Mrs. Manners caught a glimpse of him. On the day of the theft, having sent Sam Manners to lunch, he came back here to the vicarage, assumed the disguise, showed himself at the cottage window where Manners was eating, and proceeded into the churchyard. Dashing back to the vicarage again, he slipped out of his cloak and hat and waited for Mrs. Manners' knock on the door. He told Mrs. Manners to summon her husband and rendezvoused with him outside the crypt door." "And then what?" said Mr. Kingsley, insolent with fury. "I put on these boots, unlocked the church, went down to the crypt, took the money, escaped the church, jumped the stile, and ran across a mile of the field, then dashed a mile back, took off the boots, and waited calmly for Sam to arrive, whereupon I went chasing off across the field again? That would indeed have been ingenious. To do in 2 minutes what an athlete could not do in 20. Yes, indeed. The question, as my friend Dr. Watson has clarified, is precisely, how may a man chase himself across a meadow?" "And the answer?" asked the bishop. "No one will ever know at what point you took the money, Mr. Kingsley. As the key-holder, you are free to do it at your leisure, and, for all one knows, it may never have been in the crypt safe in the first place. Certainly there was no need for you to waste time on it on the day we are discussing. You wished to ensure there was just enough time with Mr. Manners at lunch for you to get to the crypt door and kick over the whitewash bucket. And of course you had given Mr. Manners the task of whitewashing that particular part of the church wall, simply to ensure that there would be a bucket there to be upturned. That was all you needed to do, because, and here is the thing, you
had made the footprints across the field on the night before. You had also, I have no doubt, planted the boots in the hedgerow on the same occasion, making sure they had plenty of white paint on the soles. Foolishly, you forgot to daub a little on the shoe laces. At this point, the vicar dropped into a chair as though all resistance had suddenly fled him, and I believe that as Holmes proceeded, we all realized that he was now approaching a devastating conclusion. At some hour of that night, Mr. Kingsley, having splashed so much whitewash on the underside of the boots that your hands were gloved with paint, you planted your white-printed trail along the footpath across the meadow to Harding Lane. Afterwards, you dropped the wide-brimmed hat by the stile and jettisoned the boots in a bush further along Harding Lane. The trail of prints was therefore neatly in place for the deception next morning, and I dare say you were solicitous to keep Mr. Manners away from the stile, where he might prematurely stumble upon your, if I may so misname it, handiwork. "But one moment," said the bishop. "If Mr. Kingsley had dropped the hat the night before, how could he have been wearing it that morning?" "Well, of course, that's simple," said Holmes. "There were two hats. And finally, there was the question of the keys." "What question was that, Holmes?" I asked. "I don't recollect any mention of keys." "Precisely. There was a distinct absence of any such mention. Why? Because a key would have been needed to enter the crypt, and Mr. Kingsley thought it better not to raise the tricky matter of how such an intruder might have got hold of one." The pale face and slumped figure of Mr. Kingsley indicated his utter defeat. The bishop clearly needed no further convincing. "The money, Kingsley," he said. "Have you spent it?" The vicar looked bitter. "I'm a gambler, Bishop. And the truth is that over the years I have burdened myself with appalling debts. I started to use the church money bit by bit. I meant to return it one day when I had a big win, but money runs through my hands like water. There's little of it left." "Then it's a matter for the police," the bishop said. "And we must find a new vicar for Hatchingham. I fear that you, Mr. Kingsley, will for years be the incumbent of a much dingier parish." The 1059 Assassin. It is now well known that the investigations of my friend and companion Sherlock Holmes, which I have had the privilege to document over the years, represent only a small portion of his life's work. Many other cases have fallen into the obscure well of history. But nothing departs this world without leaving some trace or memory.
and now and then an old story rears its head. So it was with the events of the Stovey murder. A letter came to Holmes one morning at our Baker Street apartment from Samuel Carpenter, an elderly publican at the Horse in Colours hostelry in the Kent village of Stovey. Several years previously, Samuel Carpenter had been a witness at the trial of Arthur Weeks, a local villain accused of intimidation, abduction, blackmail, and grievous bodily harm. Holmes had been involved in helping police on the case with footprint evidence, and thus had come to meet the amiable publican. I suppose we never expected to visit the quiet settlement of Stovey ever again, but the letter contained a clear and urgent summons. Dear Mr. Holmes, you did say when we made our farewells 4 years ago that if ever there should be a day when I had need of your assistance, I was to write to you immediately. I'm afraid, sir, that day has come. A terrible set of events has clouded my life, and I am quite at a loss. Arthur Weeks, that ruthless villain you helped put away, died in jail a few months ago. Ever since then, his son, Henry, has been making our lives a misery. I found my dog Catcher shot dead in the field, and twice a dead fox in our water tank. I started getting letters threatening to burn down the inn, telling me I should one day wait in vain for my wife to come home. Terrible things, but all written anonymous. Then he brazenly come and drink at the inn as innocent as you like. Well, last week our son Jack told Weeks straight there in front of all my customers that he'd gone too far and he'd better prepare himself for some serious consequences. I wish he had not done it. 2 days afterwards, Weeks was found shot through the head, and my Jack is now being arrested as a murderer. There's anything you may be able to do, Mr. Holmes, please come immediately. I knew that Holmes had taken strongly to the publican, so it was hardly a surprise to me when he asked, as is his way, whether I had any pressing engagements over the next few days, and when I said no, instructed me to pack immediately an overnight bag. Within an hour we were aboard a Kent-bound train. In Stovey village we took rooms at the Horse in Colours, and as soon as we were settled in, sat with our landlord at a table in the bar, where a large fire battled the chill in the air. Holmes said, "Now, Mr. Carpenter, the first thing you must do, if I am to help you, is to answer my questions honestly and accurately." "That I will do, Mr. Holmes." "Your Jack made a threat to Henry Weeks here in this bar?" "Yes, sir." "And 2 days later Weeks was found dead?" "Dead with a shot through his head, just outside the village where Nightingale Lane crosses the London railway line, and his horse tied up nearby." "And they came to arrest Jack when?" "That very night. But Jack wasn't here, of course." "Wasn't here?" "Jack couldn't have killed him, Mr. Holmes. Jack was already aboard the London train when Weeks was killed,
He was off to buy himself a suit for his wedding. I took him to Stovey Station myself that evening to catch the 10:59. There weren't a moment when Jack left my sight. I watched him get on that train and waved him off as it left. But the police didn't seem to think that counts for anything. Soon as he got back here next day, they carted him off, and he's now under lock and key in Maidstone jail.
Well, Mr. Carpenter, said Holmes, I accept unequivocally that what you are telling me is the truth. But my sense is that this is going to be a very convoluted business, and I must impress on you the need to be patient. When Carpenter had returned to serving his customers, I said quietly to Holmes, "Surely, if what the old chap says is true, the police have no case. Weeks must have had 100 enemies hungry for his blood, with far weaker alibis than Jack Carpenter." "Perhaps so," said Holmes, "but I fear the word of a father in defence of a son is unlikely to be regarded in court as compelling evidence, especially when the police have their minds made up in advance. Watson, I've a suspicion that things may get a lot more obscure before they become clearer. Let's make good use of the afternoon by acquainting ourselves with the details of Henry Week's unfortunate end." Our escort to the scene of the crime was a local policeman, Sergeant Berry, a man of stubborn practicality, whose uniform one suspected must have been artfully augmented to accommodate the spectacular rotundity of his belly. He clearly felt he had better things to do than to accompany a consulting detective to the scene of a crime when the culprit was already halfway to the gallows. Walking from Stovey village, we arrived at a spot about 30 yards from a level crossing, where the main London railway line traversed Nightingale Lane. "Darkhill Crossing. Corpse found here," Sergeant Berry said bluntly. 6 feet from the fence. Victim's horse still tied to the fence. Cause of death, single bullet entering just here. He put a plump finger in the centre of his brow. "Weapon?" "A gun," said the policeman insolently. "I am aware," said Holmes, clearly irritated, "that if a man is killed with a bullet, then the probable source of the missile is a firearm. What I want to know is whether the weapon has been found, or, if not, whether anyone has deduced the type of gun from the type of bullet." "No gun found," said Berry. "As for the bullet, far as I know, it's still at the end of a short tunnel into his skull. And the horse?" "Oh, I don't think we can pin it on the horse, sir," the policeman said with a smirk. "Sergeant Berry," Holmes was threateningly patient, "are you able to assist me in this investigation, or would it be more convenient to you if I were to apply to my acquaintances at the yard to find me an alternative guide?" The policeman looked suddenly chastened. "Just my joke, Mr. Holmes. Yes, I can take you to the horse, sir, and to the body." We saw the horse first. It had been stabled with the police horses in a yard in the village, a tall brown stallion with rather frightened eyes. When young, it must have been a formidable creature. Now it looked ragged from a lifetime of hard riding. Holmes looked it over carefully. The animal was skittish,
seemingly distressed, and tried to pull away when Holmes held its bridle to examine its head. I watched rather nervously as my friend entered the stable bay and walked round the animal, which threatened to jostle him against the walls. Then, when he reached the front of the creature again, Holmes said, "There's a mark here. A sharp wound, can you see?" On the right foreleg, just above the fetlock joint, was a slender but quite noticeable lesion, apparently caused fairly recently. Holmes turned to Betty again. "Was this mark here when the horse was found?" "I believe so." "Good. Well, since we seem to be in the business of investigating wounds today, you'd better show us the way to the morgue. Incidentally, Sergeant, how well do you know the accused man?" "Fairly well," replied the policeman. "Do you know whether he has friends, acquaintances, perhaps, of some intimacy?" "Well, not really that I know of, sir. He was always at his father's public house, and they were ever a close lot. Sergeant Berry stopped. He became instantly animated and businesslike. A gleam came into his eyes, and he said, "Look, there's the mortuary, Mr. Holmes, just after the church. I'll leave you to it, if I may. Just thought of something rather urgent I've got to do." And very briskly, almost running, he disappeared back towards the village. "Strange," I said to Holmes. "What do you think that was about?" "I think," said Holmes, "that I've put an idea into his head. I only hope it doesn't complicate matters." It transpired that a post-mortem on the dead man had been commissioned, but that the police pathologist had only arrived from London that morning, possibly on the same train as Holmes and myself. I knew Professor Yardley a little through my connection with St. Mary's Hospital in Paddington, and he was quite amenable to my assisting him with the matter in hand. He was a conscientious practitioner, and while the cause of death seemed evident, he thoroughly inspected the externalities of the corpse before opening it. The head wound was a clean, almost star-shaped hole, glutted with dried blood. There was no wound on the back of the head, and it was apparent that the bullet had not exited the body. "Notwithstanding that there was no weapon at the scene," Holmes said, "suicide seems out of the question, wouldn't you say? There are no powder burns to the skin, and, besides, the wound is probably too small for a close shot. I'd say the missile came from some distance." The bullet had, it turned out, penetrated the brow and lodged deep in the parietal lobe of the brain. But, as Holmes had suggested, the hole in the skull was small, and there was not the dramatic shattering of bone one might have expected from a close shot. Suicide, Professor Yardley concurred, was not a possibility. "We are certainly looking for a murderer, then," I commented to Holmes as we wandered back towards Stovey. "Well, somebody killed Henry Weeks for certain, Watson. But I have to confess that at this moment I have no idea who it was." "You don't think we might be wrong about Jack Carpenter after all?" "I do hope not, Watson. It would be an appalling tragedy. But then I suppose for one poor soul or another, murder always is." I had hoped that our next port of call would be the horse in colours, for an icy wind had blown up, and I was ready for a glass of beer and the comfort of the inn's blazing logs. But Holmes walked us straight to Stovey Station, where, he said, we must make an important call. I steeled myself against the increasing cold as the last light faded from the sky. The station-master at Stovey was Milton Fraser, a man dressed to give the impression of order and precision, his cap fitting perfectly the balding sphere of a small, neat head, and a fine silver pocket-watch peeping from his waistcoat pocket. Holmes, whose own knowledge of the country's railways is second to none, won his confidence easily. "I wish to ask you, Mr. Fraser," he said, "about yesterday evening. There is a late train to London, I believe." "The 10:59, sir." "It was on time?" "It was, as it generally is. Not much traffic on the tracks at that hour." "And do you recall whether any passengers boarded the train at Stovey?" "Of course I do, sir. Young Jack Carpenter." "Just him?" "Yes, sir. His father saw him aboard. I watched the train pull away myself." "And there is no way anyone could have left the train after that?" "Well, not here in the station, no, not without my seeing him." "Not in the station?" "No." "I suppose it might be possible for someone to alight at the crossing." "The level crossing?" "Yes, sir. The 10:59 always stops at Darkhill Crossing for a few minutes. Safety precaution, sir. Thornley Bridge over the Stour is considered unsafe for two trains until they finish the repairs, so the 10:59 up train must wait until the 11:04 down has come through." "And this happens every night?" "Can't recollect when it last didn't, sir." "Lastly, Mr. Fraser, can you recall which part of the train Mr. Carpenter boarded?" "Second compartment of the third carriage, sir. I'm quite sure of that." "Thank you, Mr. Fraser. You've been more helpful than you know." "I suppose we now have to consider," I said to my companion back at the horse in colours, as I stared into the flames of the fire, "that Jack Carpenter shot Henry Weeks from the stationary train. We must consider it, certainly, yet I think it rather unlikely. How would Carpenter have known his intended target was going to be waiting there at the crossing? Then what is the significance of the stopping train? Has it any? I'm beginning to think it has, but I must confess to being currently unsure in what way. Well, let's eat and then sleep on it," I said. But at that moment our cosy evening was horribly interrupted. A young woman, hair dishevelled, came screaming into the bar. "Mr. Carpenter! Mr. Carpenter!" The elderly landlord came rushing in from the kitchen. "What is it, Sarah?" "It's Beth Miller. They've taken her in." "Who's taken her?" "The police. That Sergeant Berry's arrested her. Says he found a gun." "What's this?" cried Holmes. "Who is Beth Miller?" "Beth is my son Jack's betrothed," Carpenter said. "Their wedding is fixed for next month. Beth's a good and honest young woman and gentle as a lamb. I'll see that blasted policeman." Holmes barred his way and put a hand on his shoulder. "If I'm to help you, Mr. Carpenter," he said, staring hard into the man's wild eyes, "believe me when I say that it will not serve our purposes to be too precipitous. Dr. Watson and I will go straight to the police station and find out what's happening.
I beg of you to do nothing before you hear from us." Having received Carpenter's assurances, we made our way out of Stovey to the police station, a thick-walled stone building halfway along to the next village. Once a brewery, it now had the grim air of a medieval lockup. It would not be exaggerating to say that my friend and I received a cool welcome from Sergeant Berry, whose domain this appeared to be. "Yes, sir, I do have a young woman in custody here, and I can confirm that she has been charged on suspicion of murder." "And can you tell me," said Holmes, "how she is supposed to have committed this crime?" "Well, obviously, sir, we don't know all the details yet, but with a bit of imagination, an intelligent person might construe that she had lured Mr. Weeks to Nightingale Lane on some, shall we say, enticing pretext, lain in wait for him, and dispatched him with a bullet as he tethered his horse." "And," said Holmes, "would this same intelligent person construe that Jack Carpenter had a part in this?" "Well, yes, sir, that person, assuming he was using his faculties, would conclude that quite obviously Jack Carpenter was an accessory before the fact, and therefore equally culpable." "Thank you, Sergeant," Holmes said, "for simplifying what I, in my sluggishness of mind, had considered a mystifying problem. Might it be possible for us to see the prisoner now?" "I'm sorry, sir, I couldn't permit that." "Or should it wait until I have received authority from my good friend Superintendent Wales at the Yard?" The policeman licked his lips, pretended to consult a piece of paper on his desk, and said, "Well, as you say you are a friend of the superintendent, sir, I'm sure 5 minutes wouldn't hurt." We were shown to a cavernous room where rusted iron remnants of the brew-house remained bolted to the walls and ceiling. The large skylight had been set with bars, and there were no other windows. A pretty dark-haired girl of no more than 20 years sat at a wooden table. She reacted to us with suspicion as we were admitted, but no sooner had the constable left us alone with her, and no doubt largely in desperation, she confided in us readily. "Miss Miller, we have a limited amount of time," Holmes said to her, "and you must tell us everything you can about this business." "Yes, sir, I'll try. I think I may have done something foolish, sir." "Foolish?" "I think I were the first to find the body, sir, you see." "Well now," said Holmes, "I had certainly not guessed that." "I planned to see my Jack on the London train," she continued, "but we was held back at the farm delivering a calf, and I knew I was likely to miss him. The train usually stops by a dark hill crossing, so I thought if I cut along Nightingale Lane, I might be able to wave him off. But when I got there, the train was already disappearing across the bridge. Then, a stone's throw from the track, I saw a horse tied up to the fence, and something on the road beside it. When I got up close, I saw who it was. Henry Weeks, covered in blood, and next to him the gun." "And you picked up the gun?"
I asked.
Yes, sir. Why? Why did you not go directly to the police? Well, sir, because I recognised the gun. I meant to hide it somewhere. It was Jack's gun, you see.
I failed to conceal my shock. Jack's gun? So you took the gun, Holmes said, because you thought Jack Carpenter might have killed Weeks?
Yes, sir. That was my fear.
Even though Jack was on the train?
I didn't know how long Weeks had lain there, sir. It's a lonely place, and he might have been there for hours. So that didn't look good for Jack, departing as he did the very same evening. I wasn't sure of nothing, Mr. Holmes, except that Jack was likely to get the blame, everyone knowing about the venom between him and the Weeks family.
And what, Holmes said, did you do with Jack's gun?
Wrapped it in my shawl, slung it on my shoulder, and took it home to hide it. But I was unlucky. On the way I passed Sergeant Berry. I think he must afterwards have puzzled over my strange burden, for he came today to search the cottage, and that's when I was arrested.
But Holmes, I said, if the murder weapon was beside the body, doesn't that at least establish Jack's innocence? Unfortunately not, Watson. The assumption we had made was that the murder occurred while Jack was on the train. If it happened well before that, I fear that either he or Miss Miller here remain the prima facie suspects.
But I didn't kill Henry Weeks, sir. I swear to God.
I don't believe you did, Miss Miller, but we have to convince the police of that. Be hopeful. But as we walked back along the lane that evening towards Stovey in the Horse in Colours, Holmes seemed somewhat less certain. I have little to go on at this moment except instinct, Watson. I do not feel that Jack Carpenter killed Henry Weeks, and I feel even more strongly that that young woman did not do it either. But feelings, I'm afraid, are not evidence. Let's hurry back to the inn and hope the bar is still available to us. Then we can make an assessment of these matters in comfort. The inn was closed to customers when we arrived, but Mr. Carpenter hastily provided us with a bottle of whiskey and some bread and cheese. The fire was still glowing bright, and I sat there for a good hour while my friend went away to ask some questions of our host. Eventually, he returned and reclaimed his seat beside the fire. Can we number the suspects in this case, Watson? Well, apart from Jack Carpenter and the girl Beth Miller, I said, dropping my voice, I suppose Jack's father, our landlord, is another possibility. Yes, and since we know he saw Jack off onto the train, either he or his son would have needed to commit the murder some time earlier. But how early? I've just spoken to him at length. He assures me, and I believe him, that there are plenty of people prepared to swear that both he and Jack were here all afternoon, and Beth spent the day at farm work. Even so, if the police go ahead and prosecute a case against one or all of them, there's a strong chance a jury might find them guilty, based purely on the assumption that they would at some time have had the opportunity. We are not out of the woods yet, Watson. I see what you mean. Our inquiries seem to have stalled. rather. I refilled our glasses from the whisky bottle, and Holmes puffed at his pipe. Then suddenly he said, "The secret is on that train, Watson. I'm sure that's where it is. What time is it?" 20 minutes to 11. "Come along. We might just get there before it leaves." It was an old cart that transported us post-haste along the hold and muddy lanes of Stovey, so that we arrived at the station splattered and not a little shaken. We were, however, in good time to meet the 10:59. Unfortunately for us, the station master, Mr. Milton Fraser, was again on duty. Despite his obvious respect for my friend, however, he became instantly resistant on hearing Holmes's request. "No, sir, I'm afraid I most definitely cannot hold up the 10:59 London train. Mr. Fraser, this is no flippant request. An innocent young woman will spend tonight locked in a dungeon, as will her fiancé, unless I am able to complete certain essential inquiries. I ask only for 10 minutes. Mr. Holmes, my reputation may be a small thing by the world's standards, but it is very important to me. 10 minutes is a long time to delay a train. But if I can guarantee you that this will not affect your reputation, can you really do that, sir?" "Mr. Fraser, you have my word on it." A long, thoughtful pause. Then, "Very well, Mr. Holmes. I'll do as you ask." When 2 minutes later the great black locomotive hauled its clanking carriages into the station, Mr. Milton Fraser went straight to the footplate and had words with the engineer. A wave to Holmes and myself, who were some way along the platform, told us all was clear, and we boarded the train. Holmes went directly to the second compartment of the third carriage, which contained just one late passenger, an elderly gentleman sitting beside what I saw immediately to be the medical bag of a general practitioner. "If I may interrupt your peace and quiet, sir," Holmes said, and having outlined his reasons, asked, "Were you aboard this train last night?" "I was," said the older man. "I take this train pretty well every night. I'm a medical man with a practice in Newbury and a home in London." "Were you in this same compartment last night?" The elderly physician laughed. "Creature of habit, sir. Same compartment every night." "And do you recollect the young man who, I believe, got onto the train at this station yesterday?" "I do, as a matter of fact. He sat there, right opposite me by the window. Pleasant young man." "Good. Now, sir, the train stopped at Dark Hill Crossing a little way up the line. Do you recall anything unusual about that?" "Oh, it stops there pretty well every night, but, well, I do remember something, as a matter of fact. The train whistled, as it usually does, to see if the down train is close enough to respond. At just that moment, I remarked a small flash of light outside the train, like the sun reflecting off brass." "And the young man," said Holmes, "what was his response?" "He seemed as puzzled as I was. He said he knew the area and couldn't imagine what it could be. "Thank you, Doctor," said Holmes. He led me briskly from the train. "We have just 3 of our 10 minutes left before the train leaves, Watson, but I think it might just be enough." Mr. Fraser was waiting for us on the platform. "All done, sir?" "One final request, Mr. Fraser. Are these the same carriages and in the same order as made up the train last night?" "Yes, sir. That doesn't change much." "Then I'll need to get onto the line to check the other side of the train." "I don't know, Mr. Holmes. The down train is due. You'll be at too much risk." "I shall be quick." And without further discussion, he re-entered the train, crossed the compartment, opened the further door, and dropped onto the down line beyond. At almost precisely that moment, we heard a whistle, and Fraser said, "By golly, Dr. Watson, that's the down train crossing the bridge." I waited for a half-minute, but when I heard the rumble of the approaching train, I could restrain myself no longer. "Holmes!" I called. "Get a move on, for God's sake!" But the last words of my sentence were drowned by the roar of a locomotive thundering into the station and hissing to a halt next to the 10:59. I'm not sure what I thought had happened. I could see that Holmes had not regained the empty compartment for a terrible moment. I hovered in a cloud of anxiety. Then his head appeared between the bottom of the train and the platform edge. He had ducked under the stationary train to avoid the incoming express. "Holmes, are you all right?" "More than all right, Watson," he said as he clambered back onto the platform. "Especially as I believe I can now name our murderer." He turned to the rather shaken station master. "The train may leave, Mr. Fraser, but there are conditions. I see there are no facilities for uncoupling a carriage here in Stovey." "Correct, sir. There are no sidings here." "Then I must ask you to travel to London with the train, and to ensure on arrival that the carriage in which the physician gentleman is travelling is impounded at Paddington." "Good Lord, Mr. Holmes! Is the doctor a suspect?" "No, Mr. Fraser. But one might say the carriage is." Despite his misgivings, the station-master was heroically compliant, and directly he had arranged for a message to be sent to his own family, he boarded the 10:59, which had now, for one night only, become the 11:25, and the train pulled out of the station on its way to London. "Well, Holmes, I probably don't need to tell you," I said, "that I am completely baffled." "You can be forgiven for that, Watson. It has been a puzzling business. But you do intend to explain to me how a train carriage can be a suspect in a murder case?" "I will explain everything when we get back to the Horse and Colours. But first I must ensure that Beth Miller is released from that appalling prison and spends tonight in her own bed." It was long past midnight when we sat again in the comfort of the inn. Though I had not been present when Holmes had put his theory before Sergeant Berry at the makeshift jail, he had clearly made a convincing argument, because Beth Miller had been immediately released and sat with us now at the rough hewn table where Samuel Carpenter, bubbling with the turn in fortune, was proving very liberal with his best ale.
"So, who was it, Mr. Holmes? Who was the murderer?"
"Well, that's not as simple a question to answer as you might think," said Holmes. "The simple answer is that Henry Weeks was the murderer."
"Do you mean it was suicide?" I said.
"Well, Watson, whatever we call it, there is no doubt that when Henry Weeks fired the gun, it was to murder Jack Carpenter." Around the table, Mr. Carpenter, Beth Miller, and I, all wearing similar baffled expressions, sat staring at Holmes, waiting for him to elucidate. "Henry Weeks," Holmes said, "went to the spot with the intention of killing young Jack. He knew the train would stop there, and he meant to get a shot at his victim through the carriage window. Things seemed to be going well for him. Jack Carpenter was sitting on the stovey side of the train, so Weeks would have had a good view of him from the lane. Here is what I believe happened. Weeks took aim, but at the very moment he was about to squeeze the trigger, the train blew its whistle. My guess is that the horse reared up and kicked the butt of the gun, hence that wound on the beast's foreleg. The gun went off." "Ah," said I, "that flash of light the physician on the train mentioned." "Precisely. The sound of the shot was probably drowned by the noise of the train. The gun barrel now tilted down, its aim sent low. The bullet hit the wheel bogie of the carriage. The mark on the metalwork is what I was so keen to check this evening, and ricocheted back to strike Henry Weeks." "So the train wheel was the killer," I said. "As I say, one could impute the train or the bullet or even the horse as accessories, for all were material in the death. But the fact of the matter is that Henry Weeks, in a rather elegant example of poetic justice, inadvertently murdered himself." Holmes and I took the first train back to London the following morning, passing on our way out of Stovey Station the sight of Weeks's lonely death. "What put you on to it, Holmes?" I asked. "I suppose you could say, Watson, that human goodness put me on to it." "Not deduction, then?" "Samuel Carpenter, his son Jack, Beth Miller. Good people, Watson. We were, if my instinct about them was correct, distinctly short of homicidal candidates. Then you'll recollect the nature of Weeks's head wound. Clearly not suicide, as you noted yourself, because of the shallow nature of the wound. But was it a deep enough lesion to have been caused by a direct hit at close range? That set me wondering about whether the bullet might have rebounded. My examination of the train confirmed it." "You're quite right about the wound. I dare say it didn't kill him outright. The poor man probably lay there for some while, bleeding to death in the cold." "Well," said Holmes, "perhaps that bleak hour may have given him time to reconsider the error of his ways." Sherlock Holmes, The Rediscovered Railway Mysteries and Other Stories, was written by John Taylor and read by Benedict Cumberbatch. It was produced by Fiction Factory and is published by BBC Audiobooks. When I was young, it contained the treasures of boyhood, a catapult, a lump of beeswax, the carapace of a crab. For many years since, it has been the repository of an archive, admittedly a rag